That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, it's a long way up here. I had forgotten that. Good morning, everybody at Myers Park Baptist Church. I am honored to be back, delighted to be back. I love this church, and I look forward to being able to greet many of you in person afterwards. As I begin, I want to invite you to sit silently for just a moment and try to get in touch with at least one of your greatest fears. What do you fear most? You're not going to have to share this out loud, but it is important to this sermon and to our lives. Okay, I will tell you, having heard Lane read Gene Owen's introduction to me 46 years ago, and having Dr. Owen say that I had talked with him about how I felt our greatest enemy is fear, that's what I'm preaching about this morning, too. I had forgotten that I had perhaps done the same thing 46 years ago, but unfortunately, that particular beat goes on. And one of my greatest fears is that our fear is so great, we are going to have immense trouble generating the kind of courage it's going to take us to make this nation and this world a place of true justice and love and compassion. That is my greatest fear, and I'm talking about myself, not just the rest of you and others in our society, but that's why Harriet Tubman can teach us so much. I want to say before I begin the sermon properly that I want to join my voice with Pope Leo. I do that in humility, and every other spiritual leader on the planet who is denouncing the unnecessary, violent, and evil assault on both God and humanity in the Middle East. I'm assuming that most, if not all of you, join me in that. And yes, I think it's terribly, terribly important. Now, I don't want to leave room in what I say this morning for each of you to decide what I mean when I insist that Harriet Tubman's moral decision to lead people out of slavery was not a one-off. That is to say, not something that the rest of us don't have to do because she did it, which is unfortunately not only how we tend to view our heroes, they do it for us, we don't have to do it, but also how most Christians interpret the life and work and ongoing spirit of Jesus of Nazareth. He did it for us. We are off the hook. It doesn't work that way. It's a mistaken view of Jesus, a mistaken view of Harriet Tubman, a mistaken view of ourselves. This is a sermon intended to put us all on the hook, on the spot, shepherds of justice and peace, prophets of the moral imperative to love fiercely, that is, to advocate for the well-being of all people, including those whom we do not know, those whom we have been taught to fear. It's up to us to keep Jesus and Harriet Tubman and other prophets and saints alive and active in our world. We are on the hook. This morning, I'll be raising up some important lessons we can learn from Harriet Tubman, but first, I think we need a little common ground on who she was. Harriet Tubman was born in 1822 in rural Maryland. It's important to realize that while we remember Harriet Tubman as an enormous figure, often referred to as the Moses of her people, a giant of a woman who led people to freedom on what would become known as the Underground Railroad, her story didn't begin that way. She was a young person with hopes and dreams stifled by being born into slavery. Minty, as she was called by her family and friends, harbored a yearning for freedom, and especially having watched in horror during her teen years as her sisters were sold and taken away. Minty became all the more determined to free herself from the monster of slavery. So in her 20s, Minty fled alone into the cover of night. With her master and her pursuers at her heels, she is said to have leapt into a raging river yelling, "Freedom or death." Because she did not immediately surface or get washed to shore, her pursuers assumed she was dead. But she had indeed washed up further downstream. Almost dead, she rose back up, determined to keep going. Before her escape, Minty had sought counsel from her pastor, a black preacher who, preaching as he did every Sunday in front of white people, publicly counseled slaves to obey their masters. But Minty's father knew better. He knew that this preacher was involved secretly in helping slaves escape. So the preacher told Minty to contact a man named David once she made it the 90-plus miles to Philadelphia. This was about 1848, when Minty was 26 years old. Once in Philly, having a taste of her own personal power and fortitude, Minty changed her name to Harriet in honor of her mother and kept her husband's name, which was Tubman. Her free name, she called it. Harriet Tubman was determined to go back and get her family to freedom. Despite David's protest that the Underground Railroad had to stay impersonal and could not focus on specific individuals or families, Harriet was determined to go back to get her husband John, her parents, and her sister. So off she went, traveling again in the night, almost 100 miles to get home to take others to freedom. When she arrived home, she found that John, having believed her to be dead, had remarried, and that his new wife was pregnant. Broken-hearted, she decided to return to Philadelphia on her own unless she could talk her parents and sister into joining her, which she could not. However, several other people did want to join Harriet and try to escape. And so in a secret journey back to Philadelphia, she set out again, this time with a handful of enslaved men, women, and even an infant with her. Drawing on what I think we can only call faith, and something stronger and more powerful than her one small self, Harriet Tubman knew that if this tiny band of people was to make it to freedom, she needed to exert authority. You do what I tell you to do, period, if you're coming with me. And so with Harriet Tubman in the lead, sometimes we are told she fell to her knees in what seemed to be a trance, seeking direction from something, from some power, some force, some spirit. Her small group made it with her to Philadelphia, much to the amazement of David and other organizers of the Underground Railroad. Over a 10-year period, Harriet returned again and again to Maryland and other parts of the mid-Atlantic to gather up slaves from town to town. She wound up becoming the most prominent conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading a total of 70 enslaved people to freedom against all odds. A cunning leader who worked in the dark, she was called Moses by many, white and black people, who knew of her only through her fiercely liberating reputation. Because of her larger-than-life aura, most white slave owners assumed that Moses was a white abolitionist man. They feared him and they hated him, while slaves, we can imagine, were in awe of Moses. With the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, Harriet and other free blacks in Philadelphia realized, of course, that any black person could get picked up and deported back to the South. Does that remind us of anything that is happening right now? No black person in the United States, even in the North, was safe. So Harriet Tubman helped black people keep heading north to Ontario, Canada, where they were able to live freely as refugees. Not in the United States, but in Canada. In Canada, Harriet met John Brown, whom she helped plan the 1859 attack at Harper's Ferry. After his death, Harriet said of Brown, and this is a quote from Harriet Tubman, "He done more in dying than 100 men would in living." Harriet Tubman. During the war, the Civil War, of course, Harriet herself worked as a scout. She worked as a spy. She worked as a nurse, and she helped organize the Combahee River raid in South Carolina that freed more than 700 slaves. Following the war, Harriet joined Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony in working for women's suffrage. Eventually, she settled in Auburn, New York, where she founded a facility for former slaves with mental challenges, and she spent time nursing them. Eventually, she became a resident of the same facility, and she died in 1913 at the age of 91. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass had become devoted friends during the days of the Underground Railroad, and at some point, Douglass wrote this to Harriet Tubman, and I quote Frederick Douglass, "Most that I have done," he wrote, "most that I have suffered in the service of our cause has been public. And I have received much encouragement at every step along the way. You, on the other hand," he wrote to her, "have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and to your heroism." And this is what Frederick Douglass said, "Except for John Brown, he of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have." So that's just a sketch of Harriet Tubman. Returning to several lessons that leapt out at me as I considered Harriet Tubman's relevance for us today, I want to name first Harriet's belief in the power of human goodness. Her own life contained seeds of goodness that sprouted when the times called for it. And I get this image from E.B. White of Charlotte's Web. E.B. White loved corresponding with fans, and he responded to a man who was depressed and distressed about the state of the world in 1973. "Dear Mr. Nadeau," E.B. White wrote, "as long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread and the scene is not desolate. Hope is the thing that is left to us in a bad time. Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say the weather is a great bluffer. I guess the same is true of our human society. Things can look dark, then a break shows in the clouds, and all is changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It's quite obvious that the human race has made a mess of life on this planet," he wrote. "But as a people, we harbor seeds of goodness that have lain for a long time waiting to sprout when the conditions are right. Our curiosity, our relentlessness, our inventiveness, our ingenuity have led us into deep, deep trouble. We can only hope that these same traits will enable us to claw our way out." Notice he doesn't say talk our way out, or pray our way out, or negotiate our way out. Claw our way out. So hang on to your hat, he said. Hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. I urge you now to take a moment and put your fear in the context of your own seeds of goodness that are waiting to sprout this very day. A little more about these seeds. We really do need to tend them, even heal them with intentionality and great care, which is one of the things a wise and compassionate and an active church can help us do. But if Christianity has done us one great service, it has been to play up our capacity to sin rather than our seeds of goodness. I'm serious about that. Not surprisingly, E.B. White didn't find Christian dogma very helpful. Instead, by his own words, he put his faith in what he called the spirit of freedom and creativity and how spiders spin their webs. White was not anti-Christian, but rather he managed to transcend Western Christianity's devotion to sin. I urge us to do the same. The church has played a huge role in making us fear ourselves, our bodies, our sexualities, our appetites, our dreams, our possibilities, and one another, especially those who are not like us. If we care about God by whatever names, and if we practice any religion, we must insist that our religion teach us that our basic inherent capacity for goodness is rooted in our connectedness, our relatedness to one another, our mutuality with one another. Our connectedness to all creation and all creatures makes us who we are and shapes our goodness as love, which is another name for God in the best Christian tradition. This radical relatedness, this mutuality, this love is the only way we can know God. It is the only way we can, and I use God as a verb here, it's the only way that we can God, we ourselves. Harriet Tubman spent most of her life Godding, loving, seeking the freedom and liberation that comes with the love of neighbor and self. That is what was motivating her, love. Number 2, Harriet Tubman herself said that fear is always the greatest enemy. I suggest that in fear, Christianity has long played down this goodness. Fear is indeed the enemy of our goodness, the enemy of our capacity to love one another. For Christians, the greatest enemy of both Jesus and God, and the enemy of all humans who harbor seeds of goodness waiting to sprout. Fear is the enemy we all must overcome if we are ever able to make justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. An example here, Jackie Robinson's widow said he always regretted letting his fear of the white baseball establishment pressure him into testifying against Paul Robeson in the 1949 McCarthy hearings. Some of you may recall that the House on Un-American Activities, which was a precursor to the Department of National Security, targeted the great American athlete and singer Paul Robeson as a communist. Robeson was a communist, as were many Americans who yearned for racial and economic justice in the mid-20th century. A number of my own friends were red diaper babies. Perhaps some of you have friends who were too. Perhaps some of you were born to communist parents in the 1940s. Now, these people may have been right, they may have been wrong, they may have been wise, they may have been foolish, but mostly these American communists were idealistic Americans who deeply wanted their country to be able to feed and clothe and house hungry people. They yearned for a nation of liberty and justice for all. Now, we can also assume that the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, who turned away from Jesus rather than consider giving his wealth to the poor, was afraid, fear-bound, afraid of something. Poverty? Loss of status? The unknown? We don't know. Perhaps in the 20th century, he might have feared that Jesus, like Paul Robeson, was a communist. I believe that Jesus of Nazareth most certainly was a socialist. And by that, I mean a believer in everyone being fed, clothed, housed, taken seriously by the government, as well as by our churches and our synagogues and our other organizations. It is no wonder that the powers of his day, Jesus' day, and of our own were and are so afraid of this Jesus. So how do we deal with our fear? Because we all have fear. Several different ways. Number one, we can pretend not to be. They say in Alcoholics Anonymous, that I belong to, that if newcomers can just pretend to be grateful, to be present, eventually they will become grateful. We can pretend that we are not afraid in any situation, and perhaps we will become more and more unafraid. That can happen. Number two, we can play into the stereotype of whatever our enemies are calling us. We can deter those who may wish us harm by play acting. And one example of this is an old African-American woman in Washington, D.C. who used to walk the streets acting like she was a mad woman. And everybody steered clear. They just let her pass because she was acting nutty. She was pretending. I have a friend, a gay man, wonderful man, who used to try to make himself safer in the city of Atlanta by putting gay artifacts like pink satin and gay rags and whatever on the bus around him so that people would stay away, and they did. They were afraid of this man who was afraid of them but was pretending not to be. Number three, we can be honest about our fear with ourselves and others. We can name it and move on. The great Black womanist poet and activist Audre Lorde said, "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So we should speak," she said. And finally, a woman, a Quaker at a rally in Boston in 1983, said something I'll always remember. "Whenever you're feeling afraid, do something, and do it with others." This is because we literally encourage and empower one another when we are working together. The power of mutuality, of guiding, of loving together. Harriet Tubman knew this. She knew and she learned that we literally encourage and empower one another. That is how we get strong and move through our fear. Like Harriet, who became a feminist activist after the Civil War, every honest American woman knows something about the harsh, negative characteristics attached to women's resistance to patriarchal norms. This has been doubly, triply, quadruply true for Black people, brown, and other women who are perceived as non-white. And so it is that, like Harriet Tubman, everyone, but women in particular, must empower each other to move through and beyond our fears. If we intend to claim our seeds of goodness, if we intend to let them sprout and scatter them on behalf of justice and the common good, we must overcome our fear. The third lesson we learn from Harriet Tubman is this: our depth of resolve, our ability to encourage and empower each other always involves a leap of faith, a movement from prioritizing religion as an established set of doctrines and rules, movement to casting ourselves into a freedom-moving spirit, open to wherever she or he or it or they may be leading us. Making such a leap can be life-changing for women and girls in a patriarchal situation like ours, and in the lives of brown or Black people in a white supremacist society like ours, and in the lives of white men and other men who are seeking to generate liberty and justice for all. Leaping in faith beyond any religious restraint may or may not involve leaving the church, putting away one's religion. But regardless, moving through fear to live and speak our truths boldly requires our willingness to leap beyond the rules and rituals of organized religion, if need be, to head for freedom, fear be damned. And this is something a church can do. You don't have to move out of the church. You can empower the church to live this way. That is what we need to be doing, dear sister and brother Christians. And the fourth lesson from Harriet Tubman is that we must act boldly. We must do what we must. We must be clear-eyed and honest about what we intend to do. Then we must push on together through our fear. Be determined, stay resilient. If we water our spiritual roots, they become the source of our faith in something that is moving in us, around us, above us, beyond us, through us, a sacred power, I suggest, that will hold us up and carry us on forever, regardless. The most remarkable thing about Harriet Tubman was her resolve and her clear-headedness, which she and others attributed to her strange, mystical, trance-inducing faith. She had stumbled into this role. She hadn't set out to be the Moses of her people. She just wanted to be free herself. But once she realized how deeply others too were yearning for liberation, she realized her role as a leader of her people. And taking a leap of faith, she made this her life's work. Those who accompanied her attested to the trances, to her prayerfulness, to her listening to voices, apparently, and then to her resolute determination to keep on keeping on and to head in a certain direction. Still, she had to let others decide whether or not to come along, including her sister and her parents, who declined. Like this Moses of her people, our work is to do what we must. And when others refuse to join us for whatever reasons, to shake the dust from our feet, as Jesus suggested, and move on without them. As I move toward closing, I want to say something about the controversial proposal to put Harriet Tubman's face on the $20 bill. You will not be surprised to know this possibility has been shelved for the time being. The shelving of the possibility, however, reflects not simply our current administration, but our current crisis, which is not new, but is ongoing. We are a nation that is currently being driven from the top by fear, but this fear was not born with Donald Trump. This fear grew up with Donald Trump and with me, and with many of you, and with all of us who were born in the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War. As American Christians, we learned the wrong lessons after World War II. We learned fear of communism as a national creed, a fear supported by the Christian churches, fear of godless communism. We learned a fear that was stronger than our faith in the power of acting together for justice, love. So it's not that we did not need to be afraid of communism. Perhaps that was wise, but there's something even stronger that we did not learn, which was the power of our faith when we act together for justice and for love. Our national leaders and church leaders, usually white Christian men, often good men individually, men like Dwight Eisenhower and Billy Graham, wrapped Christianity up in an American flag which they tied together with the increasingly idolatrous worship of unregulated capitalism. And so we baby boomers and everyone who came after us were learning to bow to what I would call a very unholy trinity of blind patriotism, fear-based Christianity, and unregulated capitalism. Not capitalism in its own purest form, but unregulated, deregulated capitalism, which we're taking together is almost interchangeable. All the while, we baby boomers and our kids were learning fear of communism, later called socialism, as a basic requirement for loving God. A basic requirement for loving God. This fear was wielded as a weapon to destroy thousands of good people like Paul Robeson and to attack every movement for social justice that has raised its head in our country over the past 80 years, and that's how old I am. Every movement for social justice has been attacked as either communist or socialist. This fear put our country on the wrong side of every war in the last half of the 20th century in order to fight against what we feared was the encroachment of Russian communism via developing nations like Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1959, the Congo in 1960, Chile in 1973, and Nicaragua in 1980. We were on the wrong side of each of those wars, the wrong side. Time and again since World War II, our country has pushed budding revolutionaries in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East away from building alliances with us, effectively steering them into partnerships with the Soviet Union and increasingly with China. And that brings me to this day. Where in the world are we in regard to this today? What are we doing? Under the gaze of a president who is doing his daily worst to make us afraid of every nation in the world that is not already in his pocket, and afraid of those Americans who do not look like us and with whom we may disagree politically. So while the controversy about putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill reflects an ongoing crisis shaped by our national fear of communism and socialism and all things liberal, it also mirrors our current government's pathological abhorrence of Black people, brown people, Asians, female, and queer heroes. Honoring Harriet Tubman in such a moment would be as unthinkable to our president and his buddies as putting Martin Luther King, Eleanor Roosevelt, or Barack Obama on Mount Rushmore. The legacies of such heroic Americans as Harriet Tubman are feared as too socialist, too woke, too liberal, too Black, too brown, too feminist to be honored or celebrated or even tolerated by patriotic Americans today. I imagine Harriet Tubman would no more care about being on America's $20 bill than she did about being honored by folks in her own time, as she was indeed honored by the likes of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But it makes me smile to imagine that someday, I believe it will happen, Harriet Tubman might adorn the $20 bill, thereby replacing Andrew Jackson, whose racism is among our most among our most xenophobic presidents is legendary. So in the midst of social turmoil like ours today, E.B. White and Harriet Tubman are standing here with us this morning, I do believe, urging us to decide if we will let our fears hold us back or if we will do whatever we can to be counted as going down with Moses to the promised land, whatever that may mean for us today. I have no doubt that Harriet Tubman would join E.B. White in urging us to follow her, to hang on to our hats, as he said, and leap, echoing her liberating words, freedom or death, in our hearts, on our signs, in our churches, by our votes, and in our lives this day and each day, now and forever. Amen.